So, ladies and gentlemen, let me welcome you here to the United States Institute of Peace. My name is Bill Taylor. I'm one of the vice presidents here. I do the Russia and Europe work, and we're real pleased to host this side event for the summit, for the NATO Summit. And we're especially pleased to co-host with the International Institute of Democracy and Electoral Assistance, IDEA, and to have NATO parliamentarians here and other NATO officials here to join us. This is an opportunity to talk about security. I mean, that's what NATO's about. It's an important connection with democracy, is why we're here talking this afternoon. And as we know, the NATO Summit is going to be about Ukraine. And Ukraine leading all the nations in the world, but I was going to say in Europe, in defending the values of democracy and independence and sovereignty against this aggression, against the Russian aggression. So it's an appropriate time at this NATO summit to talk about this issue and have Ukraine be at the top of the agenda. So I'm very pleased. We're going to have two of our representatives, our congresspeople here, and they're both in traffic. Probably no one in this building in this room has been in traffic today, but they are. And so they will join us. We're going to go ahead and start this up. We have a panel after Annika introduces us as well. And so I look forward to a great conversation. Thank you very much for being here. Annika, it's over to you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Taylor, and good afternoon, everyone. Warm welcome to this side event on strengthening security through democratic resilience. It's co-hosted by ourselves, International IDEA, and the United States Institute of Peace. I'm Annika Silva-Leander. I'm head of North America for International IDEA. I head our offices here in DC and in New York. For those of you who don't know, International IDEA is an intergovernmental organization with 35 member states, 13 of which are also members of NATO. And our mandate is to strengthen democracy and democratic resilience globally. And we do that by conducting policy-relevant research, provide technical assistance and capacity building, and convene stakeholders from diverse sectors to explore and discuss issues of common interest. And we are so delighted to gather here at USIP headquarters today to explore the critical nexus between democracy, democratic resilience, and global security on the occasion of the historic NATO Summit here in DC, which will celebrate 75 years of the transatlantic alliance. So firstly, I would like to extend our heartfelt thanks to the United States Institute of Peace for hosting this event here in your beautiful headquarters. We're also honored to have with us, in a few minutes, U.S. Representative Gerry Connolly, who will deliver a keynote address after the panel on these critical issues. Warm welcome. And today's event will also feature a panel discussion with key experts and also with closing remarks from Johan Frisell, Deputy Director General and Head of Department for Security Policy at the Swedish MFA. Thank you for joining us today. Sweden is, as you know, NATO's newest member state, together with Finland, and also host country of International IDEA in Stockholm, and also a country for which the nexus between democracy and security is a key priority. NATO's 75th anniversary marks a significant milestone for the only military alliance fundamentally based on democratic values. And the creation of NATO underscored the intrinsic link between democracy and security, a relationship that remains as relevant today as it was in 1949. The ongoing conflict in Ukraine starkly highlights this interdependence, as Ambassador Taylor already alluded to. An increasingly authoritarian Russia, threatened by the democratic aspirations of its neighbor and Ukraine's closer ties with NATO, triggered the illegal invasion, igniting the most severe conflict on European soil since World War II. And this tragic situation, with yesterday's bombing of a children's hospital in Kiev, is as one of the far too many illustrations of the barbaric nature of this war, underscores the threat posed by authoritarian aggression and reinforces the importance of upholding democratic values to ensure global peace and security. But beyond Ukraine, the nexus between democracy and security manifests through various pathways. Research consistently shows that democracies are less likely to engage in wars with each other, contributing to a more peaceful international order. And conversely, the current trend of democratic backsliding and rising authoritarianism around the world presents significant security challenges. Autocratic leaders often resort to aggressive foreign policies to consolidate power, leading to regional or global instability. And this trend is documented by organizations such as ourselves at International IDEA, but also Freedom House and VDEM, among others, which all have noted a global decline of democracy alongside an increase in conflicts in recent years. We're currently in a super cycle election year, with pivotal elections occurring in numerous countries worldwide, even here in the United States soon. And the outcomes of these elections will significantly impact security at national, regional, and global levels, influencing defense spending, geopolitical alliances, and foreign policy priorities. In addition to traditional military threats, new technologies have provided authoritarian regimes with tools to undermine democracies. Disinformation campaigns, particularly those orchestrated by authoritarian powers like Russia and China, exploit the openness of democratic societies to fuel domestic polarization and interfere in electoral processes. Cybersecurity threats are also on the rise, with attacks on critical infrastructure and political institutions posing direct risks to national security and the integrity of democratic processes such as elections. This highlights one of the many interlinkages between security, defense, and democratic processes. Democratic resilience is the capacity of democracies to withstand and recover from such internal and external threats, ensuring their stability and integrity. It is crucial for security because strong, resilient democracies prevent conflicts, promote stability, and create robust frameworks that safeguard national and global peace. And NATO has increasingly recognized the importance of democratic governance in achieving long-term security. And we in the democracy assistance community take important note of this. And a pivotal initiative in this regard is the proposal to establish a Center for Democratic Resilience within NATO. This event will provide a unique opportunity to learn more about the aims of such a center. In the audience today, we have NATO parliamentarians, US congressional representatives, NATO officials, and organizations in the DC International Democracy Assistance community, as well as defense and security experts. And these different audiences do not often come together in the same place. And the NATO Summit here in DC provides this unique opportunity to bring these varied perspectives together to discuss issues of common concern and interest, in particular the nexus between global security and democratic resilience. So we hope that this is the start of a conversation that can be sustained going forward. For those in the NATO and defense community, count on us in the democracy assistance community, whether it's in Europe or in the US or elsewhere, as your allies and partners. And together, we hope to unpack the critical linkages between democracy and security to build greater democratic resilience. So thank you so much for joining us here today. We look forward to engaging discussions and valuable insights. Enjoy the event. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Representative Connolly has actually arrived in the building, so what we'll do is we'll start with a round of introductions first. I'll introduce our distinguished panel today, and hopefully by the time I'm finished with that, he will have arrived and we can go into his remarks. My name is Calin Trenko-Vermut. I'm a security governance advisor here at the U.S. Institute of Peace, and I'm joined today by 4 distinguished colleagues. Leonie Allard, to my right, is a visiting fellow at the Atlantic Council's Europe Center, And before her current role, she worked at the French Ministry of Armed Forces in the Director General for International Relations and Strategy. She has also served at the French Embassy in Beijing and at NATO in Brussels. And to her right, I'm joined by Joseph Brinker, who serves as the New Policy Fellow on Democratic Resilience at the NATO Parliamentary Assembly. He brings to this position several decades of experience promoting democracy with organizations such as the OSCE, the UN, IOM, and over 10 years with US aid. His views on NATO, security and democratic resilience are in part rooted in the years he spent on the ground alongside NATO in Afghanistan, Bosnia, Kosovo, and North Macedonia, coupled with 5 years consulting on such topics also in Brussels. And I'm also joined today by David Salvo, who serves as the Managing Director of the German Marshall Fund's Alliance for Securing Democracy Initiative, which exposes, analyzes, and develops strategies to counter foreign information manipulation and interference in democracies, particularly in NATO ally nations. And finally, I'm also joined by Dr. Patrick Quirk, who serves as Vice President for Strategy, Innovation, and Impact at the International Republican Institute, a nonpartisan nonprofit organization dedicated to supporting democracy and political freedom worldwide. And Dr. Quirk is also a non-resident senior fellow with both Atlantic Council's Freedom and Prosperity Center and Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security. And prior to joining IRI, Dr. Quirk has also served on the US Secretary of State's policy planning staff and also the State Department's Bureau of Conflict and Stabilization Operations as a senior advisor for policy and strategy. And with that, I will turn over back to Ambassador Taylor, who will introduce Representative Connolly.
So, very flexible here. Congressman, we're very pleased to have you. Congressman Gerry Connolly represents a nearby district here in Virginia. And we're very pleased. Don't sit down, sir. You can come right up here and have a few. You can indeed. We're very pleased to have you here on this event, Congressman. We have introduced the panel. We're all set for you for the keynote address, and let me invite you up.
You know, I served in local government for 14 years before going to Congress. I look at all this traffic today. Somebody should do something about that traffic. It's great to be with you, and thank you to our panel for being ready to talk in depth about my favorite subject. When I became president of NATO's legislative arm, the Parliamentary Assembly, and in looking sort of at the history of NATO and looking at the reality we face with respect to the challenge from Putin and Russia, what struck me was we gave a lot of lip service to our shared democratic values, and we gave a zero operational commitment to them. So if you go, some of you here have heard me say this before, but I mean, if you go to NATO headquarters today in Brussels, honestly, you expect it's so modern and so forward-looking and futuristic. You expect Star Wars troopers to come out of one of the corners because it has that kind of flavor, and it's got offices devoted to interoperability and military modernization and strategic planning. And as I have said, there's not a broom closet dedicated to democracy. Not a broom closet. Now, it's 75 years. And I don't know about you, but I kind of think it's time. Because we can't just be a military alliance that doesn't like Russia. We've got to be a military alliance that is organized around and whose raison d'etre is our commitment to shared democratic values. And we have to operationalize that. When we came up with that idea a few years ago, we got every excuse in the world you might imagine from our government and from European governments. Well, the EU does that. Well, there's a think tank in Bordeaux that does that. In our government, well, it'll be too hard. We operate in consensus. You'll never get all, at that point, 30, now 32 ambassadors to agree. But But you know what was interesting was that this idea had great resonance among my fellow parliamentarians. That this made sense to them. Like, yeah, I mean that's what we do. That's what we ought to be doing. That is what this struggle in Ukraine's about, and it's what we should be about in self-identity. And we forged a consensus, and let me step aside a little bit. You know, I'm sure NATO thinks it's got its hands full when 32 defense ministers descend on Brussels. Well, we've got 300. And they're from all different parties. They're not all from the governing party. So when we put together a consensus, it's hard work. And we did. We put together a consensus not only on Ukraine, but on this, on the need to create some architecture in NATO that is dedicated to the propoundment, advocacy for, defense of, and a resource for the promotion of democracy, the preservation of democracy, the aggressive assertion of democracy. And if we needed a reminder of why that's a compelling mission and ought to really imbue everything we do as an alliance, the depravity we witness every day, and certainly 2 days ago in Ukraine by Vladimir Putin, ought to be really a poignant reminder of who we are and why we do this and what the stakes are. Lives are at stake. A way of life is at stake. And I would contend that our democratic values, our commitment to those values and those structures and those norms actually is one of the most powerful forces on the planet. It's why Putin's so nervous. Why would you go to war over Ukraine the way he has because Ukraine wants to join NATO and the EU? I mean, are you really that existentially threatened by that proposition? And the answer clearly is yes. Yes, he is. He's willing to go to enormous lengths to prevent that from happening. And, you know, the NATO response, I think, is us, our generation, meeting our test. In a way, I talked this morning about, you know, if we go back in time in the 1930s, the collective democracies failed every test. They didn't meet one. You name it. The Spanish Civil War failed. The Mussolini's invasion of Ethiopia failed. Collapse of the League of Nations as a result failed. Japanese invasion of Manchuria failed. You know, the militarization and occupation of the Rhineland failed. Anschluss failed. Sudetenland not only failed, gave it away, and then lost Czechoslovakia. So that finally, by September of 1939, it's kind of not much less to fail. We kind of had to sort of do something. But by that point, it was too late. And look at the horror and the slaughter that was the cost we paid for the lack of willpower by the collective democracies of that time. We don't have that problem today. We sometimes have a problem of getting consensus, but we have NATO. And NATO is a powerful, powerful antidote to the authoritarian impulses coming out of Russia, and for that matter, China. If you think about it, the only guardrail on Putin, and the only one he respects, is NATO. He dare not cross a NATO border because he knows Article 5 will kick in. If he didn't believe that, believe me, he would have crossed a border a long time ago. He's also seen that he underestimated us. He underestimated our willpower to come together and oppose what he was doing in Ukraine. He absolutely was counting on us for being fractured, wringing our hands, and moving on. Because that's what we did in Crimea. He also underestimated the ability of the Ukrainian people to resist his invasion and to take his military down many notches. If you go back in time 2.5 years ago, the expectation was this invasion would last about 2.5 weeks. And there'd be a puppet regime installed in Kyiv. And we'd all bemoan it, but what can you do? And that didn't happen. And it didn't happen because that wasn't our reaction. And it wasn't the reaction of the Ukrainian people. And lo and behold, the Russians were not 10 feet tall. And 2.5 years later, they're still fighting. And they're still desperately trying to figure out their advantage, their edge to conquer territory and hold on to it. And the sacrifices they've made in this foolish endeavor are enormous. And the sacrifices, of course, on the Ukrainian side are also way too high. But they have a partner. They have a partner in 32 nations as part of an alliance. So, you know, from my point of view, as president of the NATO Parliamentary Assembly, speaking on behalf of my colleagues, it's time. It's time to operationalize. It's time to stop making excuses. We are committed, or we're not, to being a democratic alliance. That's first. Not a military alliance first, democratic alliance. And that's why we formed this military alliance. The military part is so it has to play a subservient role to the primary reason we got together. And that's to preserve, defend, advocate for, be a resource for democracy. And we're good at it. We're actually succeeding. You know, we were looking at the charter, the original Atlantic charters last night at a reception on Capitol Hill for our 75th anniversary of NATO. And if you go back in time and think about, well, what was it like 75 years ago? Well, everything seemed lost. Mimi Kadeli's here. Albania was a Soviet satellite. So was Bulgaria. So was Romania. So was Hungary. So was Poland. You know, we had to reach an agreement a few years later to get the Soviets to get out of Austria. Remember, they occupied Austria. And the deal was, but Austria would not be an aligned nation. You know, Germany was split in half. You know the story. Cold War seemed like it was going to go forever, and it did. It went 50 years. And Europe, Western Europe, was in ashes. And along came two things, the Marshall Plan and NATO, coming out of here. And both of them changed the landscape. Both of them suddenly created hope and opportunity and a chance for recovery. Well, boy, we took advantage of that. We not only recovered, but the West outshone the East, you know, by light years. So much so that the Soviets had to build a wall in Berlin, not to prevent people from coming in, but to prevent people from going out and seeing our success. Collectively, we did that. And nobody would have predicted it when we were founded. I think there would have been a lot of pessimism about the future and about our ability, frankly, to, you know, somehow cohere and build a political will to do what we had to do. Think about that. 75 years later, look at what we built. Look at the enormous success of Europe and North America today. And that's an accomplishment we did collectively as part of this alliance. And that's who we are, and that's how we must muster the political will, the economic resources, the military resources to put Vladimir Putin back in his place and to restore sovereignty in Ukraine and to allow the Ukrainian people to exercise the free will of a free people to decide who they want to align with. If they want to go with Putin and they express that freely, that's their business. But they don't. They want to align with us. And because they want to be free. Imagine, that's sin. And that's the sin Putin believes they're committing. And that's the The war that he's engaged in is the terrible cost he's exacting for the temerity of a sovereign state to want to decide its own destiny. And that brings us right back to our roots. So I think we need to be in an assertive posture. I think we shouldn't be in a defensive posture. I think we have a lot to celebrate, and I think we have challenges ahead, as every generation does. And I am confident that if we remain confident and we build on our success, we will prevail in this struggle. Thank you so much for having me here today, and thank you to our panel. I can? Okay. I can.
Very grateful. Thank you so much, Ambassador Taylor, Representative Connolly. Thank you so much for your remarks. I'd like to pick up now on some of the themes that we have just heard from Representative Connolly, and I'd like to turn with my first question to all of the panelists. I'd like to ask all of you what you see as the connection between democracy and security, or perhaps put it in another way, why does democracy matter to international security? And I'll start with you, Leonie, and we'll move down the road.
Thank you so much. Much of what the representative have said resonates with me, and especially now that we're in such a crucial moment with the NATO Summit being held here. I think safeguarding democracy is really upholding our treaty. I mean, it's at the basis, it's one of the founding principles inside the North Atlantic Treaty. It's also the founding principle of the Treaty of the European Union. So in the end, we are really upholding what we're about. And as you mentioned, Putin launched a war in aggression against Ukraine, and it was its strategic interests of political and territorial control that were put in question, but it's also Ukraine's aspiration for to grow closer to democratic principles, freedom of society, autodetermination. And I just want to highlight two aspects of the nexus between security and democracy. And the first one is when our competitors and rivals seek to influence, coerce, or blackmail us, they do this within the framework of the fact that we're a democracy. And the second aspect I want to highlight is the rise of populist movement and how that's also influenced the strategy of our rivals and competitors. So when it comes to malign actors that are faced with a democratic and free society, there are three main avenues for them. And the first is, of course, to increase tensions that are internal to civil society, to generate political paralysis and subversion, to prevent or democracies to function and respond in an adequate way. The second one is to achieve specific aims, for example, in an electoral context or in the context of a military operation, to similarly have an influence or coercive or blackmailing behavior. And the third one is to prepare a future operation, or to prepare a future attack, and that is to weaken or resolve to intervene, to respond to severe or legal actions in different domains and prevent us from responding. So these are really the three big avenues, I believe, in how the competitors see or how they can influence, coerce, or blackmail us or system. And the second one is, of course, that all of this is tied to the rise of populist movements in Europe, and the fact that populist movements have tried to undermine civil society by using the vote as sort of the only link with the citizen, and then bypassing the more common media and manipulating the traditional media. And if you take political support to Ukraine, and I'm talking also from the perspective of France, 2 years ago there wasn't the common European strategic culture that we have on Russia. We had a lot of divisions on how to respond, on what to do. I mean, there are still a few, of course, linked to, for example, deep strike or escalation management, but generally you can say there is really a common strategic culture. And those are the divergences that remain today are mainly the result of populist movements within Europe rather than a large geopolitical divide on what to do with Ukraine. And we've seen that with obstacles to aid to Ukraine. We've seen that with Sweden's accession to NATO. So taking into account how much malign actors have been using populist movements is the second area I would like to highlight.
Thank you so much, Leonie.
So I'm probably going to get in the weeds on some of the other questions. So maybe on this question, it would be good for me maybe to be a bit more personal. When you talk about democracy and security, for me, having worked in this field for decades, going all the way back to the collapse of the Soviet Union, maybe I lost sight through all that work that at the outset, I never really ever separated my work on democracy from the security optic. To me, when the Soviet Union collapsed and then you had the fallout in Yugoslavia, it was so part and parcel of a security question that it maybe just became very deeply internalized in me. It was always there. And I worked with a lot of democracy colleagues over the years. And it's kind of understandable. Democracy can be really inspiring. Most people who work on democracy come from other democracies. So maybe they don't see the security angle sometimes. And it really came back strongly for me when democratic backsliding became a big issue. And then when I moved to Brussels and I started working alongside NATO again, and then even more so when I was considering applying for this post. And all of that brought me back to this idea that if you go back to that monumental moment in the early 90s, it was fundamental that these transitioning countries make it past that fulcrum, get to the other side. And when I think about some of the early elections I did in places like Bosnia, North Macedonia, Montenegro, you know, they were a little messy. These were some of the first elections. But I kind of got the sense that they were on a path where they would probably make it. And then I went to Russia in '99 for the parliamentary election there. And I came back with a very different feeling. And it wasn't nearly as optimistic. And I think over the years, we've now seen that come to roost. And so I think it's important when you think about those relationships for people who work on democracy to understand those fault lines. Because I think this isn't something that just emerged 5 years ago. These threads have always been there. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Joe. David.
So democratic stability is inherently linked to collective security and national security, inherently linked. When NATO allied countries are consumed with their own domestic disorder, their own domestic democratic instability, it inherently calls into question the resolve of supporting Ukraine, of supporting the paramount nature of NATO as the sort of the underpinning of our collective security architecture. We see these forces already happening, especially here in the United States, but also elsewhere across the transatlantic space. So when that happens, our autocratic adversaries, they pounce. We know this. We know that in those circumstances, countries like Russia are going to try to push the front lines west from Ukraine, north into the Baltics, south into the Western Balkans. This is part and parcel of their strategy. It's why they are trying to foment the type or exacerbate democratic instability in our countries. And it fuels the type of hybrid activity that they are waging every day against us because they know it contributes to even more democratic decline, which helps to sort of return the world to the great power politics of the pre-war period that Representative Connolly spoke so eloquently about. So when there are attacks on critical infrastructure, or there are information operations that try to fuel polarization in our countries, these are security questions, because when they do lead to violence in the streets, or they do lead to a fundamental lack of trust in our democratic institutions and our electoral processes, those are security questions, because they have security implications. They have foreign policy implications. They call into question the entirety of the transatlantic security architecture. That's why we have, this sort of inherent struggle with countries like Russia. So I see democratic stability as inextricably intertwined with questions of collective international security and national security as an American citizen.
Thank you, David.
Lots of common themes here and overlap. As Annika mentioned in her opening remarks, all the leading indices of democracy, including the Atlantic Council's Freedom Index, show that democracy and freedom have declined over the last 2 decades. This is very bad for the US and NATO because all of us are more secure in a world that's free and open. And the evidence on this is not debatable. It's bulletproof. Democracies are more reliable trading partners, more predictable investment environments, less likely to go to war with each other, and less apt to incubate terrorism. Now, while the recession has been bad for the US and NATO, it's frankly been a boon for China and the Kremlin. These authoritarian or revisionist countries know that they can more easily advance their interests when dealing with weak democracies or frankly autocracies. Robust democratic institutions make it harder for Xi and Putin to co-opt elites in their countries and advance their malign agendas overseas. So all this shows that supporting democracies, which NATO should be doing, particularly in strategic locations, is not some altruistic exercise. We can, of course, and should support freedom fighters and democratic institutions because it's the right thing to do. It aligns with our values. But the main reason we should do it, and we do it, to Joe's points, through a combination of diplomacy, investment, and foreign aid, is because it's good for the United States and it's good for NATO.
Thank you very much, all. David, I'd like to turn to you specifically now. What has the German Marshall Fund seen as threats to democracy, and what should NATO be doing about it?
A lot. So, we can call it hybrid threats or asymmetric threats or foreign information manipulation and interference in democracy, is the so-called FIMI toolkit that our European allies like to use. Those are the issues that I think NATO ought to be working on a daily basis. And it's not just we all know the problem, right? We've navel gazed about this threat now for about a decade. Organizations like Patrick's and mine do this from civil society perspective. It happens all across governments. We know the problem, right? So my view is that NATO needs to be involved in the resilience game. It needs to be taking these issues to ordinary Americans, Canadians, and Europeans. And here's how. There's a vast network of civil society partners who are working on these issues day in and day out. NATO is the one military organization that is working ostensibly on this issue set. Military voices are still a very trusted voice in our democratic ecosystem, especially here in the United States. But there's a real fundamental lack of understanding among ordinary citizens about why this threat matters to them on an individual basis, right? So NATO could be talking about this, the EU could be talking about this, the US government could be talking about this from a very macro level, 50,000 foot, about what hybrid threats are and why Russia wants to foment instability in our democracy. But it's really important for NATO to be taking this conversation in partnership with civil society organizations that have deep networks across our countries to explain how our adversaries are targeting them on an individual basis, on a local basis, because this is happening. That's the whole nature of hybrid threats. Attacks on banks, attacks on hospitals, attacks on critical infrastructure. That affects the ordinary American, the ordinary European. Information operations on social media platforms, that affects how Americans and Europeans think about issues of security that are at the core of NATO's mission. So it is, I think, it is absolutely necessary for NATO to be working on these issues in concert with all the force multipliers that exist in NATO allied nations, to try to build at least some semblance of resilience to democratic backsliding and some buy-in to the notion of collective security and why NATO as sort of the underpinning of that architecture matters so much to our future.
Thank you, David. Leonie, I would like to turn to you with a similar question. So you have, of course, experience with the French Ministry of the Armed Forces, but also now with the Atlantic Council. So from where you sit, what do you see as some of the key threats to democracy, and what should and could NATO do about it?
Right, I think we already have a lot of tools to address hybrid threats within NATO, within EU. but it's really evolved a lot in the recent years, and I would like to focus on four main issues. The first one is, now you have two competitors, China and Russia, that share the assessment that the international order is that is destabilized, that is fragilized in the way it is now, is favorable for their development, and they have decided that it can be further destabilized from the inside and from outside crisis. They see that democracies can be weakened with hybrid tools, and they're cooperating also. And this is quite new, especially in Europe. There have been reports that show that they're sharing more of their contacts, they're sharing more of their techniques within Europe. And it is definitely something that we would like to see, structures that are existing, but maybe new ideas on that particular issues. And I think we have some expert on that on the panel as well. And the second one is thinking about Russia's long-term strategy. I mean, these competitors, they don't see, they're blurring the war and peace, irregular, regular, the way that we've organized our societies and legal framework. I mean, for certain responses to happen in a territory, you have a certain peacetime framework. And so the answer is, how do we adapt all of these frameworks to the evolution of how our competitors are thinking about hybridity in a very integrated continuum, with the idea that with also the idea that they can be very hard to call out and attribute. And we've seen the playbook in Ukraine, and the hybrid attacks have increased within NATO. You've seen in Poland, utilization of refugees flow through Belarus as a pressure point, drones accidentally dropping in Romania. In Lithuania, you had an opposition member from Russia, attacked by hammer. So you have all these increasing hybrid threats, and some of them, like GPS jamming, etc., have impact also on broader security issues, but these are all linked as well to the undermining of our democracy. And maybe the fourth point that's really related to this is how we respond to them. I mean, and NATO should be part of the equation as much as the EU, as to how we think about again, peacetime, wartime rules, how we think about having an eastern flank that is more integrated in terms of response to hybrid threats. I mean, every country has their own way of dealing with them. Is there a way that we can be more consistent in our responses and see also, the border with Russia as one border in the way that they see it? For us, it's a much more large number of states. Even if we're very much united at the political level. And the last would be really to use the existing tools at the EU and NATO and find, complementarity, which I would be really interested to hear how, you're thinking about this complementary issue that some people have criticized in the past.
Thank you. Patrick, turning back to you and picking up on some of the themes that Leonie has also raised. So we know that China and Russia are certainly undermining democracy. Could you share with the audience some of the latest evidence from IRI's perspective on some of these efforts by the PRC and Russia to undermine democracy, and also what could be done to shore up resilience and to counter some of these challenges?
Yeah, sure. So with support from and a partnership with USAID, the State Department, National Center for Democracy, we spent a lot of time and resources digging into the way in which China and Russia are actively undermining democracy. And the way we have to look at it is there's a unique threat posed by the PRC and the Kremlin, and then a new evolving threat posed by collaboration between them. So if you start with China, Beijing views democracy as a threat. Xi Jinping, we know this, wants to create a world that's safe for the Chinese Communist Party, that is one that's open to alternatives to liberal democracy, is actively working toward this end. And we all know about the economic tools, Belt and Road. He's using economic power to strengthen anti-democratic leaders, quash dissent in other countries. But he's also actively exporting surveillance technology, sharing autocratic governance practices with, for example, political parties across Africa, and disseminating a multiplicity of other repression modalities. This is all fact, based up by case studies that we've done across the globe. As for the Kremlin, Putin, of course, is without the PRC's economic power, so he needs to lean on influence operations. he and his cronies pioneered in the Soviet era. This includes direct and indirect support to political actors who share the Kremlin's goals, in addition, of course, to military action like we're seeing in Ukraine. So our research in particular across Europe shows that the Kremlin, frankly, is not very picky about whom it tries to co-opt. For example, our analysis shows that in the ethnically polarized and very complex Bosnia and Herzegovina, the Kremlin has attempted somewhat overtly to build ties with Bosniak, Croat, and Serb nationalists alike. So those are individual threats, but Putin and Xi are frankly collaborating more and more. This friendship without limits slogan, right, isn't just a bumper sticker. It's a credo that these autocrats for life are actually putting into practice. And our research at IR has identified that narrative collusion is one of the many, but indeed the primary area that China and Russia are collaborating. So what does this look like in practice? It means that state media outlets on the Chinese side and Russian side are pushing the same distorted stories across a multiplicity of platforms to advance anti-US, anti-Western, and perhaps most important for this conversation, anti-democracy propaganda. So that's a problem. What do we actually do about it, and what's NATO's role in the solution? I think there are three things. One is start investing resources now in understanding and addressing the challenge. Hence, the Center for Excellence needs to happen tout de suite. Two, you need to start investing in mitigating the risks. For instance, we know that the Kremlin and PRC engage in economic coercion. How can NATO, perhaps led by the center, start planning for how to respond to these threats? And finally, we need to continue good governance and anti-corruption reforms. The sources of resilience that we found per our research to malign influence are remarkably consistent across the range of countries that we work in. These include free media, robust political opposition, an informed public, so on and so forth. It's not a coincidence, and I'll close on this, that the elements of democracy that check authoritarian behavior by rulers at home are a bulwark against the worst parts of a foreign authoritarian influence abroad, and we need to be actively supporting them.
Thank you so much. Joe, turning to you, you're with the NATO Parliamentary Assembly. So can you tell our audience a little bit about the role of the Assembly in enhancing transatlantic cooperation on democracy, and also how does it work to address some of these very challenges that we've heard about from our other panelists today?
Great, thanks. Well, first I would note that we hear this a lot when we're working within NATO structures and with the NATO Parliamentary Assembly, that NATO is both a political and a security alliance. And sometimes the political element gets lost. So when you think about the role NATO can play and the NATO Parliamentary Assembly can play in questions of democratic resilience, you can look at the fact that a lot of the other organizations that are tasked with democracy issues and democratic resilience, they're different venues, right? They have different memberships, they have different mandates. But NATO has a mandate that covers things that some of these other organizations cannot. The nexus with security is much more tightly there. And so that's, I think, one important element. And I think it's important to get that across to the people who do democracy, because sometimes I don't think that registers. That security, I think we're starting to talk about it now, right? And you can see the way security plays a role in all this. And then, of course, NATO, with its charter explicitly stating its relationship to democracy, with its latest strategic concept reiterating and doubling down on NATO's role on democracy. You see that it can play that role. NATO can be a political convener that talks about these issues. And when you look at the NATO Parliamentary Assembly, it's particularly special in a number of ways. First, it's delegations of legislators from the allies coming together on a regular basis to build relations and to talk about a whole host of issues, including issues of democracy and security. And so they have they add a layer that extends back to all of these communities, all of these countries that are part of that umbrella, and they contribute to that conversation. What we're trying to do by pushing for this center is to nail down that a bit more within NATO itself. Another thing that I think is special about the NATO PA is, unlike NATO proper, the NATO PA can pass resolutions with a majority. They don't need consensus. And so in that way, the PA has this additional voice where they can press on issues towards finding consensus. So it expands the conversation. It keeps ideas at play that are short of consensus. And so I think that's another really important element.
Thank you for that, Joe. I'd like to now turn back to Leonie, David, and Patrick, and ask you guys, how might we envision the role of NATO in countering different types of hybrid and non-kinetic threats to our democracies? Perhaps starting with you, Leonie.
You mean sorry, could you read the question?
Yeah, so how might we envision a role for NATO in countering different types of hybrid and non-kinetic threats? Obviously, a lot of the conversation usually focuses on military threats, but in this case, hybrid and non-kinetic threats.
Right. I mean, NATO already has a hybrid support team, I believe, that's already working on the cyber domains, the resilience domains, and also the kinetic domains, which I assume would have a particular role in link to the organization that you're proposing to implement. And for me, it's also how NATO will collaborate with institutions like the European Union, and when it comes to economic coercion, they have toolboxes that are existing. There's a hybrid fusion cell that's existing, cyber strategy, and a center of excellence also on hybrid threats and informational threats. I think it's about enhancing our existing tools, complementing them with new ones. But a lot of the framework is already there, and if we can find ways, including through the center, to enhance their ability to act, I think that would be the key.
Thank you, Leonie. David?
There are a couple buzzwords in the countering FEMI sort of issue set that I think are appropriate in the NATO context too. And it's rapid response mechanism and information sharing. There are other organizations that are obviously doing this. The G7 has a rapid response mechanism. The EU External Action Service has, the Commission, I believe, has a information sharing and analysis center on sort of foreign interference and information manipulation challenges. NATO obviously has all these bodies that were just referenced, but there aren't those connections, I think, to other industries that are working on these issues. Civil society, industry itself. I think one of the clever things about the EU's ISAC is that it does have links to civil society. So it's government officials and civil society representatives forming a rapid response tool and information sharing tool together. I understand the sensitivities of doing that in the NATO context, given military and intelligence equities. But again, NATO can't work on these issues in isolation. Like, these are issues that inherently touch on other aspects of other parts of pillars of democratic society. So I think setting up some sort of body within NATO that facilitates those links to either the EU ISACs of the world, or simply sets up a body that's connected to civil society and industry to create some sort of information sharing mechanism that allows NATO to deal with these threats in real time with the other parts of democracy that are working on these challenges, through which these threats manifest. Like that is absolutely necessary. And whether that lives in the Center for Democratic Resilience or in another, another NATO body, I leave that to other people to figure out. But I think that mechanism is necessary in the NATO context as well.
Yeah, a lot of similar ideas, but one of the key hybrid threats that NATO I think can address more squarely is weaponization of information, which David has touched on. If you look at both the PRC and Kremlin, they rely quite heavily, if not exclusively, on narratives of their own infallibility, the superiority of their model, etc. NATO and its members, frankly, need to counter those narratives with the truth, perhaps led by the center, another outfit, whether by dismantling the Kremlin's narratives about its economic might or the PRC narratives about the strength of its economic model. NATO countries, alone and together, need to speak more directly and frequently about the threat that the authoritarian model poses to the alliance and those individual nations.
If I may just add something.
Please,
I mean, you talk about non-kinetic activities, but some of these activities have direct kinetic impact or look to have a kinetic impact even though they're not. And that's also where, institutions like NATO have much more legitimacy to deal with them. And I'm thinking of, one of the major cases that happened to the French military in Gossi in Mali, which was, a manipulation, physical manipulation to create a mass grave that was completely false, and then information that was propagated around that, and that led to some uprisings and had direct kinetic impacts, operational impact. So, it's very difficult. And coming back to the notion of our competitors seeing things in a continuum, it's very difficult to separate both and say they're non-kinetic and kinetic, because all of this is treated in a very integrated way by our competitors in ways which our democratic institutions would never allow. So this is the place also where I think NATO as a military organization has maybe also more of a bigger role to play in dealing with this, kinetic impacts of non-kinetic and vice versa.
Well, I think you certainly point to something very important, is that the consequences of these operations very often do cross the line, and they do move into this other sphere, which becomes inevitably kinetic, or has certainly that potential. But I'd like to now turn to the main proposition that we heard about from Representative Connolly, which is this idea to establish essentially a center for democratic resilience. And so, Joe, I'd like to turn back to you and ask you if you could tell us a little bit more about the center. How is it envisaged to sit within NATO's architecture? How would it function, and sort of what types of challenges do you anticipate it facing, or what opportunities might it actually create?
Great, thanks. Well, clearly there's no one better to talk about this than Representative Connolly. He's a hard act to follow, and I'm not going to repeat the things he said so well. So I'll take this in a slightly different angle. And when you talk about where something like this might fit within NATO, there's been talk. Well, first of all, I think there's no need to get too prescriptive right now. I think because democracy work is both operational and political, it could rest in a number of different places. Where the talk has been so far is to have something within the operations division of NATO, possibly linked somehow with the building integrity program. But I really think that we don't have to necessarily go too deep into that right now. There may be other resting places in NATO for a body like this. And I think with time, that will play itself out. Quite frankly, I think you've already heard the case, and I'll repeat and add some elements to it. It's kind of a no-brainer. But right now, we are facing one hurdle, which is we don't have consensus. I think if there was consensus on this, things would flow rather quickly, and yeah, there's a lot of things that a center like this could immediately start having a positive impact on. But what I think is essential is that this center reside inside NATO, wherever that may be, and not as some outside body. Why? For a host of diverse reasons. Some are profoundly symbolic, and others, I think, are more operational and structural. I had been doing some thinking on my own about this idea before I ever conceived of joining the NATO PA Secretariat. And my ideas were a bit more on the operational and structural side. And the way NATO PA has approached this has been a bit more political and has focused a bit more on the symbolism. I think symbolically, the message we need to convey about NATO and democracy can only be properly delivered if the center is within NATO and is not some adjunct relationship. And I think everyone can see why that would be the case. But the operational and political reasons are equally as compelling. I come back to my own experience that democracy issues present fundamental considerations for NATO in the field. So I worked alongside NATO on democracy in Afghanistan, Bosnia, Kosovo, and North Macedonia. And NATO participates in democracy initiatives in places such as these, whether it likes it or not, at times as a vital partner. And yet it's been doing all of this for all of these years on an ad hoc basis. And it would benefit tremendously if there was a core at NATO headquarters that brings all of these matters together in a coherent way. The benefits and efficiencies to the alliance would be, I think, tremendous. It's kind of organizational 101, whether you're distributing toothpaste or running an airline, that you need a core to project your efforts in the most effective way. I think we can all see that. I mean, this is fairly low-hanging fruit. NATO would also benefit, as any organization would, from the institutional memory and lessons learned it could capture from having a center. Anytime you're engaging in endeavors, if you want to capture that institutional memory, you want to be probing for lessons learned, and you want to be able to enshrine those and preserve those and build on those. So I think that's a huge benefit that could come from this. And I mean, think about how much valuable institutional memory has been lost over the years because NATO did not have a central repository on democracy issues. And this institutional memory, again, needs to reside at NATO, not as some adjacent entity. Otherwise, it's not really institutional memory. Is it? I don't think it is. A center, we see it already in this room, and we've heard it talked about today. The center would also embody and sustain important relationships with a host of democracy institutions, so that when an issue comes up, NATO immediately knows who to contact, and it is confident that it's going to get a timely response. And so maybe I'm showing my age, but NATO needs a Rolodex. And somebody who's keeping that Rolodex, and when something comes up, they know who to call. In fact, that's kind of how this talk came together. We were calling around people we knew. Can we make this happen? Yes, we can. Great. NATO needs more of that at the headquarters level. And then there's a resource that the center can bring that's been talked about a lot already by the NATO PA, by Representative Connolly, and that is that the center can be a really useful voluntary resource for the allies themselves. So when the allies themselves have questions on democracy, they have another door that they can knock on. And it makes sense. Again, some democracy issues can be better addressed by looking at other democracies' experience. And as we've already discussed, and as I've already highlighted, NATO's place in that world with the security perspective is rather unique. So once you have a center set up, the things that NATO could help with for the allies could also be very interesting. And then this is maybe more me than what's been in the concept so far, but one thing I've been thinking about too is, and this gets back to Ambassador Taylor's remarks and some of the other remarks that the panelists have had, and that is that a center can also take on some of the more philosophical questions about the raison d'etre of NATO where democracy sits on some of these fault lines with the challenges it faces. And I think there, and not all these things are going to happen at the same time. But if the center were to evolve, it could also become a repository for those kinds of questions too. So NATO has somebody resident thinking about, well, where does this all stack up, our relationship with democracy and these security questions? So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Staying on the topic of the center, we have, and I think Leonie already alluded to some of this in her remarks, but there are other NATO initiatives that focus on, say, hybrid threats. There's a European Center of Excellence on countering hybrid threats, for instance. There are a number of other sort of NATO centers of excellence. Could you shed a little bit of light on how the Center for Democratic Resilience would actually sort of work with and or collaborate and complement the work of some of this other NATO centers of excellence, but also more broadly within NATO member states, but also in multilateral institutions, there are a number of initiatives that focus on democratic resilience. So how would this new center complement their work as well?
Right. So I've kind of already addressed the question a little bit in that, again, NATO has been doing a lot of this work ad hoc. When NATO is in Afghanistan, for example, and there's an election, NATO is called upon often to provide logistical support. They're there for security. They have diplomatic know-how. They have intelligence, and so when they're in a theater like that, the UN's knocking on their door. The OSCE was actually in Afghanistan, so the OSCE was doing monitoring missions there. You have all of the democracy implementers, and having worked for USAID on Afghanistan and Pakistan, and my colleague Brian Boats in the back there, we were working with practically every democracy implementer that USAID could possibly work with at various times in Afghanistan, just because of the scope of the work there. And so NATO's already playing that role. And so having something at NATO headquarters, again, would allow for those relationships to be better synchronized, better harmonized. And again, a lot of those relationships are lost once an operation ends. So if there's information going back to HQ, then that information has a better chance of being drawn upon for future relationships, for growing those relationships with other multilateral institutions, with the implementers, with the development organizations.
Thank you for that. I will turn in a minute to our audience for some questions, but before I do that, I wanted to give you all a final opportunity to comment on one question, which is that many regard, of course, NATO as a political military alliance. They feel that the alliance should focus on a host of military challenges. There are plenty of those. Combat readiness. One we can discuss many of them. And so there will be critics who say that the alliance should be focusing on those rather than on democratic resilience. So what would you say to those who would argue that NATO should not be focusing really on strengthening democratic resilience and focus on its original kind of what they would say is its core business, which is in the military sphere? Maybe we'll start on this at this time with Patrick. So.
Sure, I think the people making that case would be engaged in what one might colloquially call whistling past the graveyard, right? Putting on this brave face, thinking that you can make evil spirits go away if you just proceed accordingly, right? And that's just not the reality we're living in. Yes, NATO is principally a military alliance, but its mandate states that it should be addressing pressing threats to allied nations, and threats to democratic resilience are chief among those that those nations face today. So we have to stop whistling past the graveyard. Yeah.
Thank you, Patrick. David?
I'd just say briefly, if it's a political military alliance, then there has to be some sort of emphasis on the political and not the military. And the political is the shared values that sort of binds us all together, and that those values are democratic values. And I think the more NATO focuses on questions of democratic stability, the less it has to invest in military readiness. Like that is the link between security and democracy. So I think it's, especially as we sort of resurrect conversations about percentage of GDP being invested in NATO and how much of our GDP we invest in collective security, like if we are stable democratically, then there's less we have to do on the military preparedness side of that coin.
Thank you, David. Joe.
Yeah, so we've heard a lot about how NATO is an alliance of democracies, and sometimes Representative Connolly, in just in the few months that I've been working with him, sometimes he'll make the point that at its origin, this idea that NATO was an alliance of democracies was not really fully cooked, and it took some time and evolution. But the reality is that that's the case today. There are some challenges, but that is the case today. And when you look at the invasion of Ukraine, you have to really keep an eye on the fact of, why is there a conflict? And part of it, a major part of it, is that Russia's worldview is misaligned with sort of our conceptions of a democratic world. It's still operating off of a way of projecting power that hasn't really, in some ways, tactically, it's evolved a lot when it comes to technology, information warfare, and things like that. But in other ways, it just looks at Ukraine and it says, well, you're not going to vote by walking. You're not going to vote with your feet. That's our sphere of influence. And I think in other parts of the world, there's been some evolution away from that, particularly among democracies, that countries have a choice in which direction they're going to go. It might still be messy. No one's arguing that the world of international relations 101, nobody debates that there's still sort of, it's a world of anarchy, whether it's Hobbesian, Lockean, or Kantian anarchy, it's still anarchy, right? But there's been a shift in the world, and that shift has created a gap with a country like Russia. And increasingly now, as they're trying to find friends with China, North Korea, Iran, and the like. So there's a pushback there. But I think the more NATO acknowledges that, it needs to acknowledge that, because it's fundamental to the confrontations that it's seeing. So,
thank you, Joe. And Leonie.
Thank you. I mean, this kind of brings us back to our first comments on nexus, on security and democracy. And I would just say, democratic resilience is at the basis of our ability to respond as a political military alliance. We've talked about the way our competitors are able to, again, influence, coerce, or blackmail societies, their ability to, prepare an area for a future operation. And this is as much about the pressing Ukraine war than it is about tackling the long-term challenge that Russia would like to pose to European security as a whole. So, absolutely.
Thank you for that. And with that, I'd like to open it up to questions from the audience. If I could ask you to state your name and your affiliation, and keep your questions brief if possible, so we can get to as many of you as possible, and ideally direct them to a specific panelist, or if you'd like, a set of panelists. I see some hands have already gone up here. Ma'am, yes, please. And we have people with microphones, so you'll be handed it. There we go. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. My name is Mimi Kodeli. I'm coming from Albania, and I spent half of my 6 years life with a lot of lack of democracy in my place. So I know what democratic resilience means. Well, I used to be Minister of Defense of my country, and I'm part of the NATO PA organization since 2017, the day I left the office. And I was one of the vices of Congressman Connolly, so I've been one of the biggest supporters of his idea of having that kind of center within the NATO headquarters. Maybe just because I grew up with a lack of democracy. So, because it depends many times of your personal background, the way you respect your future. Well, by saying that, I think that I would like to thank all of you, and but just we need to be very careful in not having inflation of the word democracy, resilience, and all this kind of stuff. Because sometimes we tend to speak a lot about that, not understand it deeply. Why I'm saying that? There are in place a lot of economic interests. And I'm sharing with you just one information. Big European democracies are buying uranium from Russia during war times. And I'm stopping here. This is one thing. The other thing is that we need to trust each other, guys. Albania is part of NATO since 15 years. And by my experience, because I stood in the office for 4 years, 4 long years as a Minister of Defense. So, and I'm in politics since 25 years. So, modestly, I have to say that I have to share my experience with you guys. Because of lack of trust, a very heavy, grave event happened in one of the Brussels airports some years ago with a big blast. And can you imagine that the military intelligence service of Albania had that information, and the Belgians said, "We don't trust you. You don't know what you're talking about." And I'm stopping here. The other thing is that by standing, all of us, we can handle any kind of bad situation, because none of us, even the biggest, the most important country in the world, cannot do it just because of a different kind of war. The countries which are with hybrid democracies or non-democracies at all are, facing us. So Russians might be the weakest country compared to the West. Yeah, Russia is our problem with Russia. It's not Russia. It's their alliance. It's her alliance. It's its alliance with the others, like China, like Iran, like North Korea, like all hell of countries over there, which has a lot of lack of democracy. So I have to thank you. Because of that, we are having that situation. And I'm ending by saying that a couple of years ago, I guess, we had this strategic paper from NATO, which we discussed in the NATO PA. A couple of years ago, in the strategic paper of all the best ever strategic guys working on that, the name China was never mentioned. Am I right, guys? And then we said, how comes? China is there. It's going to be there for a while. It's going to be a big problem of us if we're not going to deal with the issue. Not just Russia. Russia is just one part of the puzzle. So we need... Maybe I agree with you. There are so many know-how institutions that can help us. But with the Democratic Resilience Center within the NATO headquarters, we need to demonstrate that we do care democracy. And it's a political issue. It's a political organization. It's not a military one. I'm a civilian person, and I supervised all the military troops and the armed forces of Albania. Yes, that's why we are all together, and that's why the Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation used to be a general coming from the army, not a civilian one. I'm stopping here because it's a very complicated thing, but we're here as parliamentarians to assure you to assure ourselves that without you as think tankers, we had made all the political decisions that we want to. All together, same place, same discussions, same future. Even us, which can have decisions as politicians, cannot do the best we can without being all together and without having trust our domestic democracies, to our common democracies. So thank you for having us here, and thank you for being here, and thank you for sharing time with us, with the hope that we will meet someday discussing far more beautiful issues than dealing with wars.
Thank you.
Thanks again.
Thank you, Minister, for your remarks. I think you raised a number of very important issues, and certainly also in the space of trust and how a center perhaps or democratic resilience could actually also help in this regard. But thank you. And I see we have another hand up right next to you. So.
I'm Julie Zarotz. I am a member of parliament for a riding or constituency in Toronto in Canada. And I also chair our Canada NATO Parliamentary Association. I am working very much on disinformation and trying to tackle it more from we're the governing party in Canada. So I want to let you know my goal, and I'm completely the opposite of Mimi. I've always grown up in a very strong democracy, but I do see that it is weakening as well. So I want to make a few points. I have been studying the different countries within NATO and what they're doing around disinformation or some hybrid warfare, and it's pretty easy to see some of the best practices. The US and Canada act very differently than any of your Baltic countries that are closer to Russia, because their survival actually have depended on them being very aware of hybrid warfare or disinformation. And so the language they use, disinformation is warfare, mass communication. So how is it that they educate their population? Setting up independent agencies like the Agency for Psychological Warfare, having minister in charge of disinformation. A number of countries have that. And then transparency. So when there is disinformation campaigns going on. So my point being, there's already a lot of great information out there. And I'll be honest, I tend to get very frustrated when there's a lot of talk. For me, it's let's just get to actually engaging in the action. The Secretary General, the current one, if he's asked, what do we do about disinformation? He says the best thing you can do for disinformation is actually have free, independent media. And that's a key thing that he says. I like the idea of a Institute for Democratic Resilience within NATO. I like the idea that it could be a gather of best practices and action plans for those who might want to enact that. One of my biggest worries in terms of weakening of democracies is the United States of America. There's a huge weakening of democracies, democratic institutions here, and I can go into huge parts of that, but I won't. And maybe the last thing I'll mention to you is I cannot understand the last point I have here. And I have democracy deterrence. I have no clue what that is. The comment that you made, Joe, about Congressman Connolly saying he doesn't think that NATO originally started in terms of protecting democratic values. That really actually triggered something in my mind. I think that's true. And I think that it was about deterrence, just peace, and it wasn't necessarily to promote the democratic values initially, and that's something that we've adopted over time. So that was a great point, so I just want to say thanks for that. So anyways, thank you for this great conversation, and I don't need particularly anything responded to other than there's a number of us that are actively working to tackle this, and there's a lot of best practices that are out there that we can actually learn from and implement right away.
Can I just come in on one of her points? And that is, you're tired of the talk. And I just want to emphasize that when it comes to action, if we were to get consensus on the center could be up and running in a year. It's actually quite a modest proposal. Initially, they're talking about maybe one staffer. It wouldn't cost much. The infrastructure is there to put this on top of any host of different things within NATO that would provide a supportive nest for the center. And again, in terms of like cost, when you think about what NATO has possibly been losing, and it might be hard to quantify, in inefficiencies on all these democracy initiatives, all these things where they touch upon democracy by not having some kind of core that brings it all together. I think the cost savings far exceed whatever cost would be required to get this up and running. So with the right will, this could be up and running in a year, no problem.
I'm afraid that this is all that we have time for. I'm grateful to our distinguished panelists for a very fruitful and enlightening conversation, and also, of course, to our audience here at the U.S. Institute of Peace and online for joining us today for this conversation. And it is now my distinct honor to introduce Johan Frisell, the Deputy Director General and Head of the Department for Security Policy at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Kingdom of Sweden.
I want to use this opportunity to thank the panel warmly for a very interesting discussion, and of course Congressman Connolly, Ambassador Taylor. It's been a very rewarding to be here. Thanks a lot. Thanks U.S. Institute of Peace and International IDEA for for hosting this. We are proud to have one day, around 30 years ago, taken the first initiative for the creation of the institute that Annika is, where she's heading the office here in the United States. A few things. I'm not going to summarize or draw any conclusions, but the last few years we have seen how the increasing internal repression within the Russian Federation has developed in parallel to a growing neo-imperialist agenda with the war and with the normalization of war as a concept from the Russian government vis-à-vis its voters. We see the return of geopolitical tensions that look like the ones we had during the Cold War. They are not only about territory and resources and influence and military matters, they are about ideology. We thought for 25 years or so after the end of the Cold War that it was the end of ideological rivalry or competition. We see it's coming back now, and the rivals are the democratic world against the others, and then we have to admit there are a number of countries in between. We have compared NATO with other potential alliances. Russia-China. Russia-China is interest-based cooperation. It's transactional. It's not value-based. They are not really friends. If you look at NATO, and for that sake, European Union, it's of a completely different quality. Many of you have referred, and it was a part of the underlying start of the discussion, that democracies are much less likely, and in some instances entirely unlikely, to to start armed conflicts, and the correlation between democracy and international security, national security, and human security is well documented in research. It can't be disputed anymore. But of course, what do we do with that information? How do we reach out to constituencies in countries where democracy is failing and authoritarianism is on its increase? How do we come across with the message that you're not only losing gradually your democratic rights, but you are also sliding into a society where it is more likely that you will end up in an armed conflict? So how do we use this very compelling research evidence to actually make a change in these countries that are now gliding? That's a question for us to take back, I think. Over the last 30 years, when we have seen the growth of NATO with a number of countries from Eastern and Central Europe, my recollection is that they wanted to be members of the European Union and NATO, not only for economic reasons or for security reasons, because these were the two primary organizations that manifested the democratic basis that they had sought, and many of these countries had experienced democracy for some time in their history as well. So I think we have also evidence that countries seek NATO membership to reinforce and to have their democracy recognized. Congressman Connolly was right, and this has been repeated by several of you in the panel, that the democracy part of the alliance might not be highlighted enough. And looking back at our own accession to NATO, we applied in May 2 years ago. We are now members since 4 months back. For us, and I have to admit that, maybe that is something we should have looked upon differently, the notion to join NATO because to anchor ourselves better into the democratic community was not really part of the narrative or the story. We took for granted that NATO was an alliance of democracies. We knew that, and we experienced how NATO said, we have a number of criteria for any country applying for NATO membership. Be a democracy, respect for human rights, rule of law, anti-corruption, and we also took for granted that NATO would basically approve of our application and check these boxes without much process. But once now inside the alliance, we also feel how the notion of keeping NATO an alliance of democracies, how these values are actually a glue that sticks and that keeps this alliance strong. We will hear in many of the festive speeches these days that NATO is the most successful military alliance in modern times, and that is not only because we have shared interests, but I think the added quality that makes the alliance so strong is that it is founded on common values, and democracy is one of the key values here. And for that reason, I think this discussion was very good, and you have managed to highlight an aspect of the 75th year celebration that we have to bring attention to. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.